Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. Back with you with the next video in my series reading The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Without further ado, returning to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer as read by Lord Naren White. Doodlebug, Doodlebug, tell me what I want to know. Doodlebug, Doodlebug, tell me what I want to know. The sand began to work, and presently a small black bug appeared for a second, and then darted under again in a fright. He doesn't tell. So it was a witch that done it. I just knowed it. He well knew the futility of trying to contend against witches, so he gave up discouraged. But it occurred to him that he might as well have the marble he had just thrown away, and therefore he went and made a patient search for it, but he could not find it. Now he went back to his treasure house and carefully placed himself just as he had been standing when he tossed the marble away. Then he took another marble from his pocket and tossed it in the same way, saying, "Brother, go find your brother." He watched where it had stopped and went there and looked, but it must have fallen short or gone too far, so he tried twice more. The last repetition was successful. The two marbles lay within a foot of each other. Just here, the blast of a toy tin trumpet came faintly down the green aisles of the forest. Tom flung off his jacket and trousers and turned a suspender into a belt, raked away some brush behind the rotten log, disclosing a rude bow and an arrow, a lath sword, and a tin trumpet, and in a moment had seized these things and bounded away, bare-legged, with fluttering shirt. He presently halted under a great elm, blew an answering blast, and then began to tiptoe and look warily out, this way and that. He said cautiously to an imaginary company, "Hold, my merry men! Keep hid till I blow!" Now appeared Joe Harper, as airily clad and elaborately armed as Tom. Tom called, "Hold! Who comes here into Sherwood Forest without my pass?" "Guy of Geeseborn wants no pass. Who art thou that dares to hold such language?" said Tom, prompting, for they talked, by the book, from memory. "Who art thou that dares to hold such language?" "I am indeed. I am Robin Hood, as thy caitiff carcase soon shall know." "Then art thou indeed that famous outlaw? Right, gladly will I dispute with thee the passes of the merry wood. Have at thee!" They took their lath swords, dumped their other traps on the ground, struck a fencing attitude foot to foot, and began a grave, careful combat. "Two up and two down," presently Tom said. "Now if you've got the hang, go it lively." So they went it lively, panting and perspiring with the work. By and by, Tom shouted, "Fall! Fall! Why don't you fall?" "I shan't. Why don't you fall yourself? You're getting the worst of it." "Why, that ain't anything. I can't fall. That ain't the way it is in the book." "The book says." "Then with one backhanded stroke he slew poor Guy of Geeseborn." "You're to turn round and let me hit you in the back." There was no getting around the authorities, so Joe turned, received the whack, and fell. "Now," said Joe, getting up, "you got to let me kill you. That's fair." "Why? I can't do that. It ain't in the book." "Well, it's blame mean, that's all." "Well, say, Joe, you can be Friar Tuck or Much the miller's son, and lamb me with a quarter staff, or I'll be the Sheriff of Nottingham, and you be Robin Hood a little while and kill me." This was satisfactory, and so the adventures were carried out. Then Tom became Robin Hood again, and was allowed by the treacherous nun to bleed his strength away through his neglected wound. And at last Joe, representing a whole tribe of weeping outlaws, dragged him sadly forth, gave his bow into his feeble hands, and Tom said, "Where this arrow falls, there bury poor Robin Hood under the greenwood tree." Then he shot the arrow and fell back and would have died, but he lit on a nettle and sprang up too gaily for a corpse. The boys dressed themselves, hid their accoutrements, and went off grieving that there were no outlaws anymore, and wondering what modern civilization could claim to have done to compensate for their loss. They said they would rather be outlaws a year in Sherwood Forest than President of the United States forever. Chapter 9. At 9:30 that night, Tom and Sid were sent to bed, as usual. They said their prayers, and Sid was soon asleep. Tom lay awake and waited, in restless impatience. When it seemed to him that it must be nearly daylight, he heard the clock strike 10. This was despair. He would have tossed and fidgeted, as his nerves demanded, but he was afraid he might wake Sid. So he lay still and stared up into the dark. Everything was dismally still. By and by, out of the stillness, little, scarcely perceptible, noises began to emphasize themselves. The tickling of the clock began to bring itself into notice. Old beams began to crack mysteriously. The stars creaked faintly. Evidently spirits were abroad. A measured, muffled snore issued from Aunt Polly's chamber, and now the tiresome chirping of a cricket that no human ingenuity could locate began. Next, the ghastly ticking of a death watch in the wall at the bed's head made Tom shudder. It meant that somebody's days were numbered. Then the howl of a far-off dog rose on the night air, and was answered by a fainter howl from a remoter distance. Tom was in an agony. At last she was satisfied that time had ceased and eternity begun. He began to doze in spite of himself. The clock chimed 11, but he did not hear it. And then there came, mingling with his half-formed dreams, a most melancholy caterwauling. The raising of a neighboring window disturbed him. A cry of "Scat, you devil!" and the crash of an empty bottle against the back of an aunt's woodshed brought him wide awake, and a single minute later he was dressed and out of the window and creeping along the roof of the L on all fours. He meowed with caution once or twice as he went, then jumped to the roof of the woodshed and thence to the ground. Huckleberry Finn was there, with his dead cat. The boys moved off and disappeared in the gloom. At the end of half an hour they were wading through the tall grass of the graveyard. It was a graveyard of the old-fashioned western kind. It was on a hill about 1.5 miles from the village. It had a crazy board fence around it, which leaned inward in places and outward the rest of the time, but stood upright nowhere. Grass and weeds grew rank over the whole cemetery, as the old graves were sunken in. There was not a tombstone on the place. Round-topped, worm-eaten boards staggered over the graves, leaning for support and finding none. Sacred to the memory of so-and-so had been painted on them once, but it could no longer have been read on most of them now, even if there had been light. A faint wind moaned through the trees, and Tom feared it might be the spirits of the dead complaining at being disturbed. The boys talked little, and only under their breath, for the time and the place and the pervading solemnity and silence oppressed their spirits. They found the sharp new heap they were seeking, and ensconced themselves within the protection of 3 great elms that drew in a bunch within a few feet of the grave. Then they waited in silence for what seemed a long time. The hooting of a distant owl was all the sound that troubled the dead stillness. Tom's reflections grew oppressive. He must force some talk. So he said in a whisper, "Hucky, do you believe the dead people like it for us to be here?" Huckleberry whispered, "We'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.